For this wrap skirt, you're going to need your shell fabric, lining fabric if your shell fabric is somewhat see-through, and some fusible interfacing. We're going to be drafting this pattern from scratch, so you'll need to take a few measurements to get started. The first is your waist measurement plus 0.25 inches or 6 millimeters for ease. Next is your hip measurement plus 0.5 inches or 1.2 centimeters for ease. Then you'll need your waist to hem measurement, which I used 13 inches in length for my skirt, but you can change that to whichever length you'd like. And then you'll need your waist to hip measurement. And lastly, you'll need your hip to hem, which can be calculated by taking your waist to hem measurement and subtracting your waist to hip measurement. You'll need to do a little bit more math before moving on to the drafting. Divide your waist including ease by 4 and your hip including ease by 4. So to begin, draw a straight line, points A to B being the waist to hem measurement or the length of your entire skirt. A to C will be your waist to hip measurement. A to D will be your waist with ease divided by 4 that we just calculated. C to E will be your hip with ease divided by 4 that we just calculated. B to F will be the same. Then you'll want to connect line D to E and E to F. And then 0.5 inches up from point F will be point G. 0.5 inches up from point D will be point H. 0.25 inches right of point H will be point I. And then A to J will be 5 inches. B to K is also 5 inches. Connect J to K. And drop point L 1 inch down from point K. So to refine the pattern, we're just going to start softening out some of these curves so we have our ideal fit. Beginning by softening curve I, D, E, and G. Next is curve I to A, then point G to point B, then point G to point L, and the rest of these we're just connecting as straight lines, A to B, A to J, J to L, and lastly B to K. This will leave you with 3 pattern piece components, 1, 2, and 3. And for the left overlapping front panel, you'll use all 3 pieces. For the front right overlap, you'll just use panels 1 and 2. And for the back panel, you'll use just piece 1, aligning the dotted edge on the fold of your fabric. I didn't add seam allowance to my pattern, but of course you can choose to do that if you wish. I'm just eyeballing about 1/2 inch seam allowance all around for all of my pattern pieces. Once you have your 3 pieces all mapped out, you can easily slash them and connect them with tape so that they're easy to separate. If you are also including a lining in your skirt, you'll just repeat this same process with all of your lining pieces. The only caveat is making sure that your lining sits inside of your shell fabric. So I would make it 1/2 inch shorter and 1/2 inch inward on the front panels, but you'll see what that looks like towards the end of the video. Now I'm just pinning my pattern pieces together at the side seams, wrong sides touching so I can start my French seam process. To sew French seams, I like to start by sewing with the wrong sides together at about 3/8 of an inch, and then I trim that down to about 1/16 of an inch or as close as I can get to the stitches without cutting through. And then when I flip it inside out to the wrong sides touching, I'm able to sew at about 1/8 of an inch. So there's a nice narrow seam on the inside of the skirt. Of course, press your seam flat to help set your stitches when you're done. And you should have a nice clean seam on the inside of your skirt. This works even if you don't have a lining. On the front inside edge of my skirt pieces, and I'll repeat this process for the hem as well, I'm using a heat-proof ruler and folding my edge over by 1/4 of an inch and folding it again by 1/4 of an inch. So we have a double folded 1/4 inch hem, pressing it, and then you'll see I top stitch this in place just under 1/4 of an inch on the top stitching to make sure that I catch that fold on the underside.
Your words are like bullets now, sometimes they hurt. I stay high when bullets fly. Out of reach, won't be coming down. I can't wait till it's over. Can't wait till it's ends.
If you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I pretty much rely on my dress form for most of my drafting and draping, but I did sew before I had a dress form, so I wanted to kind of bring it back to how I would do this process if I didn't have a dress form, because a lot of people don't have access to one. So if we're trying on our skirt, I have it pinned at the side seams right at my hips, and I'm trying to determine where I want my darts to be. So you can see there's extra fabric in the back that I'm just pinching right at center back, measuring the width of how wide it is right at the top waistband, and also how long it needs to be in length to where it tapers to a point. And I'm going to transfer those measurements into darts on my flat fabric. To position the darts, you're going to break the back of your skirt up into thirds. At each of those third marks, drop down the length that you measured, and at the top you'll draw across the width that you measured perpendicular to that line and connect those lines to the tapered point. You can see I actually drew it on my fabric because I like to have lines to follow, so I know my darts go right off the edge of the fabric. And I also have an easy line to fold in half and follow as I sew. When sewing your dart, you'll backstitch at the top, but not at the bottom where it comes to a taper. Instead, just run right off the edge of the fabric and tie your threads by hand in a knot, and it helps it to look a lot cleaner. Of course, press your darts to set your stitches and just push them to one direction. Next, I'm repeating the same double fold process that I did on the inside edge of the front panels, but I'm repeating it for the hem. So I'm folding up once with a 1/4 inch. Using my ruler as reference, I'll link the one that I use down below. Folding it one more time, pressing it, and then top stitching again. So once I top stitch, I did want to show you how I finish my threads to the inside, because top stitching will leave long thread tails on the top of your garment, which we don't want. So I thread them through a needle and bring them to the underside or the wrong side of the fabric. And then I just tie them by hand, like I tied the ends of the darts. I just tie them together and then snip them off. And then we don't have any little like stubby, pokey threads coming out of the front of the piece. So this is what the basic shell of the skirt should look like. I'm double checking the length of my waistband before I cut my waistband piece. So you'll want yours to be your full waist measurement with ease, plus 10 inches, which accounts for our 2 overlapping front panels and 1 inch for seam allowance, 2.5 inches in width, and then an interfacing piece that is inset by 0.5 inches, placing my fusible interfacing fusible side down with the wrong side of my fabric facing up on the shell fabric. I like to tack the fusible interfacing on the fabric with the tip of the iron so I can remove the pins and then continue to press it and fuse it together. Next, I'm folding my waistband in half and just pressing it. You can see I have my lining fabric that looks almost exactly identical to my shell fabric. It's just inset about 1/2 inch in length and width of the front panels. 1/2 inch less overlap, I should say. So before I add my waistband, because I have lining, if you have a lining, you'll do this too. Position your side seams together and then pin around all the way to the outside your lining fabric to your shell fabric. I have the right side of my lining touching the wrong side of my shell fabric. And then I'm pinning my waistband right sides together to the sandwich of lining and shell fabric. And I'm leaving about 1/2 inch off the edge of the shell. You will see why in a second. And then I'm just sewing it 1/4 inch all the way across the top of the waistband. You'll want to press that upwards when you're done. And I'm taking my heat-proof ruler again and pressing it 1/4 inch. This is only a single fold this time, we're not doing a double fold. And since I already pressed my waistband in half, I can easily fold that extra short piece at the end over so it aligns perfectly with the front of my overlapping front panel. And that 1/4 inch that we just ironed down will cover our raw edge right at the top. And I'm top stitching right along the edge of the waistband. Next, we'll need to cut our ties. The tie coming out of the front overlapping piece is shorter at about 20 inches or 50 centimeters. And the back overlapping piece is longer since it needs to wrap around our waist and come out through the front. The measurements you'll need for that are on screen. And we only have seam allowance on one end because the raw end that we're not finishing with the double folded 1/4 inch hem is going to be stuffed inside the waistband, so we won't see it anyway. No point in finishing it. I'm folding over twice as I have done across the whole project, and then just top stitching it down. And then I'm folding right sides together to create 2 tubes. I'm sewing pretty much as close as I can to the edge of the fabric, but if you need more seam allowance, you can add more to your 1 inch width. And then I am flipping my tubes inside out. As you can see, the waistband has a little pocket, and that's where we're going to put the raw end of our ties. I'm starting with the front overlapping piece and taking my shorter tie, placing the raw end of the short tie about a 1/2 inch deep inside the waistband, and eyeball centering it vertically on the waistband as well. I'm repeating the same thing with the back overlapping piece, taking the long tie, pushing it in about 1/2 inch, and pinning it in place to get ready to sew. And of course, I'm bringing my threads to the back side and tying them off. Now the last step is going to be sewing a buttonhole that our back tie can peek through to come to the front. I'm marking 7 inches on the inside edge of the back overlapping piece, so the piece with the long tie, 7 inches in from that edge. And then I'm sewing a 3/4 inch buttonhole centered in the waistband. So I have all my markings, and you'll just want to sew your buttonhole according to your machine's instructions. I like to use fray check before I cut open the buttonhole, so I'm just applying a little bit to the center on the front and back of the waistband and letting it dry before I cut it open. And then placing pins at the top and bottom of the buttonhole will help prevent you from cutting through the top and bottom of that buttonhole. And then I did end up adding a little bit more fray check once I cut the buttonhole open, but that is it for this piece. So let's see how it turned out.
You think